Hello. This videocast will take you through some of the key features of Stephen Lee's essay called How Extensive Was the Support for Hitler and Nazism? There's a screenshot of the actual Stephen Lee book. It's from his chapter 6. There are two essays in that chapter. The podcast is drawing upon my own notes from the first essay, but there is a second essay there, so if you can make sure that you follow up by reading the second essay, conscious that there will be a wider audience for this videocast, but specifically for my own teaching group. What I'm doing in this particular video is I'm finishing off the lesson. So the first half of the chapter we've already covered in class. I'll offer a quick précis at the beginning of the sort of key features of the first half, but we'll be focusing on the second half, which is about the women, the army and the churches. Okay, so specific note to my own class, do make sure that you pick up on that second essay, which I'll upload to the usual Padlet area. So moving on to the next point. Okay, additional follow-up, and I've made reference to that in class as well. So a really excellent chapter by Noakes and Pridham. It's a brief chapter by the standards of Noakes and Pridham because it doesn't have that many documents in it, but it's called The Regime and the People. And we began our first lesson on this particular topic. We actually looked at the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, and that's very much sort of focusing on the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft. Also a reminder that you can play another YouTube video in which I'll walk and talk you through the key features of that particular podcast on the regime and the people. So the usual, go to the usual area. Obviously you can't click on those links because this is a video, but just go to my YouTube channel at J Malone and go to the playlists, and it's the playlist on Nazi policies, which you'll find that one in. Okay, so as I say, I'll give you a quick recap. If you don't feel you need it, you can sort of zoom past this, but just a reminder of the key points. So we did look at the Volksgemeinschaft, in particular picking up some of the key points from the Noakes and Pridham chapter, and in a nutshell, so the big debate is about consent. Those are the key points from it. Okay, so just zooming in. So first point, terminology. Key goal of the Nazi dictatorship was very much about restoring the spirit of 1914, overcoming divisions, uniting all classes behind that concept of a national community united by race and by coming together against external enemies. We then drilled a bit more into that, and so in a nutshell, the Nazis, through their propaganda, both in the rise to power, but also during the national uprising months of 1933 and onwards, portrayed the democratic Weimar years as the worst years of German history, almost wanting to erase those 14 years in the collective memory of the nation. Contrasting their own leadership as overcoming those divisions, and realising, because of the contradictions within their own party programme, their 25-point programme, that tried to sort of appeal to everybody, that the only real way you could create national unity was to have a clear focus on external enemies. And in the rise to power, those external enemies were in particular the external threat of communism, and sitting behind that, Jews, who in that period, communists and Jews were very much associated as the same thing. We'll develop the issue of the Jews in the next lesson, by the way. And again, I'll do a YouTube video on that. And then that sort of concept of the national people's community, which was sort of probably there were two sort of like key concepts that underpin Nazi propaganda. The first was the centrality of Hitler himself. Again, that sort of unifying force, focus on the individual. And the second was this sort of idea of a national racial community. The point being there, it was deliberately vague. So that's got its swings and roundabouts, it's got its strengths and weaknesses, but in terms of the strengths, because it was deliberately vague, with the exception of Jews and communists, most Germans at some point or other were able to identify with it. So I flipped back to the previous page there. And then the final point, developing that idea of consent, it was the duty of good Germans to put the nation before your own individual happiness, to overcome that division. And that was another sort of central message that was effectively put through by propaganda, and much of the evidence is that many Germans bought into that message and accepted and believed in that message to an extent. Okay, so let's get then into the main Stephen Lee chapter. So as I said, we did in the first two lessons we have covered much of the chapter. So just in a nutshell, go through some of those key points that we've covered so far. Okay, so we've covered these sort of 5 areas. So again, you can just whiz through this. You don't need to listen to me talk about it unless you want to sort of like me to help you with a quick recap. We'll just go through it very quickly. So Hitler's popularity in a nutshell was a key reason why most Germans consented to the Nazi regime. Okay, so that centrality of Hitler, other political parties in the 1920s and the early 1930s focused on their political message rather than their leaders. So that was a distinctive feature that you need to be sort of picking up on. Very much sort of highlighted by Kershaw in his book, The Hitler Myth, written a long time ago in the 1980s, but still very important today. Then you need to obviously to be able to explain the reasons for that popularity, and so much of this is explored, has been developed by Ian Kershaw. 3 factors. That key thing from his chapter, Führer Without Sin, he was seen to be a moderate in comparison to the Nazi Party itself. So as I say, if you haven't yet read that crucial chapter from Kershaw's book, The Hitler Myth, please make sure you do that. Okay, it's called Führer Without Sin. Secondly, Hitler's simple lifestyle, very appealing to the German people. We've looked at his style of leadership, very unusual. Okay, but that was an important factor. Almost like a selfless man giving over his own happiness to the German people, had a strong appeal across the all social classes for Germans. And then he delivered. He delivered on results. When other people, in particular the Conservatives who put him into power, were always arguing, you can't do that, this won't work, Hitler seemed to overcome divisions, in particular with foreign policy, revisionism, challenging the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in the 1930s without taking the country to war. And then, of course, even though eventually he did take the country into a war that German people did really not want to happen, another level appeared. He appeared to be the most amazing military commander, and so many people who had doubted the going to war thought, well, we're going to win this war. So at each level, Hitler's popularity increased. But there was negativity, okay? So that's obviously one half of the argument, and beneath that, you could flip it around. Although most Germans had a reason to support Hitler, most Germans at some point or another had a reason to oppose Hitler. And that was especially, we start to see that sort of like quantum shift, that shift in popular opinion from the late 1930s. But the argument, of course, is by the late 1930s, particularly 1938 onwards, you start to see sullen resentment kick in particular amongst the ordinary working class people, but to some extent amongst the middle class as well. But by then it was too late, and fear of the consequences, and that's the sort of like, by that point, the SS was a key factor. The police state had gradually strengthened and strengthened and strengthened in the first 5 years, and we'll pick up on that one a bit later on. But that made active opposition difficult. But don't over-egg that one. The other one is really important, the legal nature of the regime. The fact that, and that's why the legal revolution is so important, in particular for binding the middle classes to the Nazi regime. Middle classes very sort of like legally very respectful of law and order. That's why they put Hitler into power, because they felt that the Weimar years had invited chaos through too much freedom being given to the people, which had allowed the communists a foothold in German society. And so the fact that Hitler created a dictatorship legally without reverting to sort of like the revolutionary methods that he tried to use in 1923 with the beer hall putsch was a big factor. And we then developed that point about the middle classes, okay, traditionally seen to be the most enthusiastic supporters, and certainly the case throughout the 12 years of the Third Reich. They did continue to be active supporters of the Nazis, and a lot of that developed by the historian Aly, A-L-L-Y, personally benefited from Nazi policies, no doubt about that. Not just materially in terms of accruing wealth from the plunder policy, looting, the preparation for war benefited many of the working classes, but also in particular with white collar workers, social opportunity for social mobility that they'd never had before, even in the Weimar era, but certainly in the Second Reich, very sort of like class fixed society, and whatever class you were born into, it was difficult to move upwards. But the Nazis, because they had a new order in which order was built on race rather than social class, gave opportunities for active supporters of the regime to actually become important and to have status. So that was an important thing, in particular for the middle classes. But we also developed that point that other middle classes, and in particular the artisans, the craft workers, the lower middle classes, never really did benefit. And the irony is, of course, they were the most active supporters of the Nazis in the rise to power, but they were largely forced out economically because inevitably, with the preparation for war, big business prospered at the expense of small business units, and so craft workers and shopkeepers, etc., did not benefit. And many of those people ended up working as functionaries within many the Nazi organisations, the mass control organisations, in particular the German Workers' Front, but there were many others. So we developed that point as well. And then finally, kind of like linking to that, mentioned there the German Workers' Front, the working classes. The traditional view is that the working classes were the social group that benefited least, that gave least support to the Nazis, and that's undoubtedly true. Their representative bodies, the first two, they're political ones, the SPD and the KPD, and then their economic representations, the trade unions, all forcibly crushed in the national uprising and through the process of Gleichschaltung in 1933. But a lot of recent research has actually demonstrated that many workers, although never really active supporters of the Nazis, they did give passive support. They benefited from, in particular, from the relative increase in their economic status. Never forget the fact that the Nazis took power at the peak of the Great Depression, and so certainly in the first 5 years of the Nazi regime, the workers would often say, well, things are better under Hitler because at least we have work. But by 1938, as the regime was approaching war and the full employment had been reached, that those working classes attitudes became more negative again. They became sort of like sullenly hostile. Why are there is full employment now. Why are we not sort of seeing consumer goods in shops, etc., etc.? And very conscious of the fact that actually the German Workers' Front, which had seemed to be sort of quite exciting and new and giving them benefits, package holidays and theatre trips in the early years, was actually more of an instrument of control. But by then, of course, the power of the police state was much stronger as well. And then, of course, with the outbreak of war, the police state became even stronger. So we've developed all of those sort of like points. That's in a nutshell that were covered in the first half of the chapter. And now we'll sort of like take you through the final three elements of Stephen Lee's chapter, which is about women, the army and the churches. Okay, so again, just a reminder, the beauty of a YouTube video is you can pause at any point. You're looking at the class notes. Okay, so you'll see the class notes as we go through. You've hopefully got the mind map in front of you, and you can see the strands and the points. Try to sort of pull out the key points and map them as we go through. Women in a nutshell. Okay, so the traditional view is that women resented the regime. Okay, and that's kind of that view again is in the last sort of 30 or 40 years. There's been a lot more research on that. I mean, you can understand where the traditional view came from, because never forget that when the Second Reich collapsed in 1918 and was replaced by the Weimar Republic, the Weimar era for women was one of incredible freedom, not just in comparison to the relative lack of freedom that women had in the Second Reich, but also in comparison to other democratic countries. And Germany led the way globally in the 1920s. Women were given the full vote in 1919. And in particular, culturally and socially, given so many opportunities, and the classic image of the Weimar era was of liberated women who were enjoying themselves, enjoying the fruits of the golden era under Stresemann, going to clubs, and that sort of image of the liberated women sort of like through their fashion and enjoying nightlife. And it is certainly true that image attracted a lot of attention around the world. A lot of foreign tourists visited Germany in the 1920s, attracted by the excitement of Berlin and the sort of cultural vibrancy of Germany in the 1920s. So that's one way of looking at it. So when Hitler took power in 1933, of course, very, very traditional view of women. Women, their place was in the home. Various laws were passed by the Nazis, which took them out of the workplace and basically said your role is ultimately to produce women, to produce children, to strengthen Germany. And that was true. There were all sorts of incentives. And after about 5 years of Nazi rule, employment opportunities for women had decreased. In particular, higher education opportunities. Higher education was very much the preserve of young men and not women. So, therefore, the assumption would be, well, women had all that wonderful freedom that they gained during the Weimar Republic taken away from them. They therefore must have resented that. Okay, so the sort of image of resentment. But much recent research has shown that the picture is much more complex, and that actually many, many women actively supported the Nazi regime in spite of the fact that under Hitler they lost their newly won freedoms. So, notes, and again you can pause the screen and sort of like look at the detail here. But what are the key points that we need to be pulling out here? So there's the old view, okay, highlighted in bold for you. and using keywords, sort of like women were forced into compliance by the Nazi regime. So Hitler took power, and that sort of forced into compliance. Nice word that to use. The use of that their rights were repressed. Use the word liberate rather than freedom. Okay, and there's a nice little summary for you of what I've just said to you about sort of like culture and socially confident. Again, develop the vocabulary there when you're talking about that. They've got the vote, they've got the opportunities and work. There's another nice word for you to be using when you're talking about how historians' views have changed. Use that word that word historiography. It is important, remember, with A-level to be sort of using academic vocabulary, which is, I think, a key target for many people in the group, is to develop that in the second half of the A-level course. So, more complex picture, okay? And that's what needs to come across if you talking about women. Now, remember, with this particular topic, it straddles both the depth study 3, which is looking at Germany 1933 to 35 in depth, but also much of this material you can use in the breadth study. If you were to get a question about women 1871 to 1990 over the 120 years, you would have to write a paragraph about women in Nazi Germany. So you'd have to somehow capture the changes of women, so that this information could be used in that part of the specification as well. So there's the point. There's that word resentment. Okay, and it is certainly the case. Don't over-egg it and say it was not the case. You mustn't talk in extremes and say that the old view is now wrong. It's not that. Okay, it's more complex. So you want to emphasise the fact that Nazi propaganda led by Joseph Goebbels was very effective, not uniformly and not equally over the whole of the 12 years, but undoubtedly, certainly in the early 1930s, many women were attracted to the Nazi regime because of its emphasis on traditional values. And a lot of work has been done on that, and although, yes, it is true in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic, women were liberated and given opportunities. For every German woman who enjoyed the opportunities of going to Berlin and enjoying the nightlife and the social freedom and the new fashion, there were many women who felt that change was not good. That is true of life, is that there's always an opposite point of view. And in a sense, it is that sort of sense of the speed of the change, the way in which the change happened so quickly in the 1920s, unsettled many women. And never forget also that there were 2 million more women than men in Germany in the 1920s, simply because of the male casualties in World War One. So many women in the 1920s didn't really associate the Weimar Republic with the sort of freedom. They associated the Weimar Republic with the hard work of bringing up families as single mothers. So when the Nazis came along and emphasised the family and gave maternity benefits and support and incentives to become a mother and to look after your children, that was very, very appealing for many women. So you really need to emphasise those sort of positive feelings. And the point is to say is, in particular, the sort of welfare provision of the Nazis, from the women's point of view, was very, very good. The benefits that were offered, the financial assistance. So the marriage loan scheme that was introduced in 1933, in the summer of 1933, that provided for every or incentives for young couples to get married, and the incentive was that for every child you had, you get an enormous loan. It was kind of like fixed. You could only spend it in on certain types of shops that mainly sold household furniture and things like that. The loan had to be repaid, but for every child you had, a quarter of the loan was cancelled. So if you had 4 children, effectively over time, the loan was cancelled. So those sorts of incentives. But there was a lot of welfare benefits scheme. So moving on, some of those are mentioned here, but you can pick those up in the books. Okay, so there's the point about opportunity, giving opportunities for women. The Nazi regime actively created opportunities for women to contribute, new roles. The Nazis created new organisations to mobilise women to support the regime. They also were used to mobilise the message that women's place was in the home, but they were popular. Okay, one of them was the National Socialist Frauenschaft, and there's statistics there for you. So there were many women who were actively politically activist, going out and giving messages and agreeing with what the Nazis were saying about our place is in the home. Nice little quote from Lee there, which sums it up. And also some Nazi feminists who were very, very active in supporting Nazi messages that women were different from men, and the women's main role in life was to have a mate and to basically have as many children to strengthen Germany as possible. But some of those feminists, likewise, but they agreed with the Nazi regime. They were not challenging, they were supporting Hitler, but they also were brave enough to argue that the active supporters of the Nazis should have a public role and should be have jobs, and they shouldn't just be in the home, that they should be allowed to become lawyers and civil servants, etc. Okay, they were a tiny minority, but there's an example one there. You can sort of find out a little bit more about her, do a bit of research on Sophie Roger-Byrne as an example of that. Okay, let's move on. So that's the women. I say more complex picture than we previously thought. Similarly, with the army, a much more complex picture. We've done quite a lot of work on the army. We did a whole lesson on the army fairly recently. But again, let's just go through the sort of key points. So you've got the traditional view, okay? The historians writing in, when we say traditional view, we're saying the first group of historians straight after World War II, trying to sort of like comprehend this movement called Nazism. Are very difficult because remember, historians in the 1950s did not really have the full access to to the archives, to historical archives. I mean, while Hitler was in power, the West could only get the Nazi version of what life was like living in Germany. Of course, that was heavily biased to the successors of the regime. Now, with the death of Hitler and the end of World War II, of course, you could argue that historians could get into Germany and look at the archives, but actually, remember that Berlin, where many of the sort of historical archives about Nazism, where much of the evidence about Nazism existed, well, for the first 40 years after World War II, you got the Cold War, and Berlin lay in the heart of the communist sector. Now, I know there was West Berlin, which the Americans controlled, but much of the historical evidence about Nazism was not accessible to Western historians during the Cold War, which is why when the Cold War ended, historians suddenly had access to a lot more historical evidence. And so that's why these views have changed over time. Okay, so the traditional view was that the Great Prussian Army had played a key role in putting Hitler into power. And historians knew that at the time. We know in 1933 that the army was instrumental in persuading Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor. We know that they were largely compliant, that they passively continued to back the Nazis because Hitler's policies in the 1930s served the interests of the army. And we also know that as war approached, many army officers began to change their mind about Hitler. They had never really backed Hitler into power because they supported his path for war. Hitler kept that largely hidden, and the army officers wanted Hitler to make Germany stronger, but to do that by being a strong diplomat fighting over the conference table, and they never really wanted Germany to go to war. So when war approached, many officers began to regret the fact that they had supported, and in particular an example of that would be General Beck. We also mentioned Blomberg and Fritsch, who were forced out of office in 1937 and 1938 by Hitler, shamed out of office. So that's your traditional view, okay? So an army that had backed Hitler into power and who effectively at heart did not want war and changed their mind. But then new evidence, a lot of evidence has come through and has shown that it was much, much more complex. And in part, there's some evidence, or quite a lot of evidence, that now shows that even when war did break out, that many army officers were actively supporting the war more than we thought. And also a lot more research about the fact that this institution, the German army, which previously historians always thought had kind of existed protected and had never really been taken over by the Nazis, even throughout the 12 years that they were a separate institution that were never really infiltrated by the Nazis, that were sort of bound to Hitler by their oath of loyalty in 1934. The recent picture has shown actually the boundary between Nazism and the army became much more blurred, and that actually the Waffen-SS increasingly infiltrated the army. So, the detail, again, you read through the point by point. I won't take you through every single one. There it is about the traditional view, largely dominated by and subservient to the Nazi regime. To a large extent, that view is still valid, a bit like the women don't completely debunk the old view. It is still there and it is still taken seriously. Yes, the evidence that the army was grateful to Hitler, the importance of the Night of the Long Knives, and there's a picture there of the army oath that followed the Night of the Long Knives. They, at the time, believed Hitler was taking strong action to protect their independence, and that sort of confirmed their view that they were, in a sense, controlling Hitler and Hitler was working for them. That's how they saw the Night of the Long Knives. All of those points are still valid, okay? But more complex. Over time, things began to change. So the army was, in a sense, increasingly Nazified, and we now sort of see that oath of allegiance that followed the Night of the Long Knives as the beginning of a process. Remember, the oath for a soldier was completely binding. The concept of military excellence is based on you must never question the rules. And because of the legality of the Nazi revolution and because of the oath that followed the Night of the Long Knives, at a later stage when doubts began to appear, that oath in a sense trapped the army. They were never able, they may have wanted to oppose Hitler, but they felt we can't because we have sworn that oath. And working hand in hand, there was a gradual infiltration of Nazi values into the army. So the army adopted the swastika insignia on their uniforms. And there's that key word, indoctrination, gradually. And that happened over time. So, you think by, say, 1940, Hitler had been in power 7 years. So the army of 1940 was different from the army of 1933. The soldiers in their early 20s, many of those soldiers by 1940 had gone through the Hitler Youth, and they'd gone through the education in Nazi values because they had gone through the Hitler Youth process. Whereas in 1933-34, the young soldiers had never had that. So the army gradually, as the years passed, particularly in the lower ranks, younger soldiers were increasingly indoctrinated by Nazi values, which is why taking the argument that the army was a separate, un-Nazified institution is not really, doesn't really sort of stand anymore. And there's some more information that sort of like develops that concept, and there's that other sort of important point, the SS. Now, the SS grew. It was originally, the original role in the 1930s, an elite group that had nothing to do with the army. They were Hitler's personal bodyguards. And then they began to expand. They really emerged with the Night of the Long Knives when they were the executioners, to the SA leadership, and then between 1933 and 1936 they largely expanded in terms of taking over the policing of Germany, but they were not really anything to do with the German army as such. But Himmler was a very, very ambitious man. The SS actually, in Himmler's view, ultimately would grow and take over all aspects of German life. And we, as historians, can now see actually that was true. Not really visible at the time, and certainly not visible in the same way to the West, who were subject to the kind of like propaganda view of what Nazism was about. But we now know that actually, say you look at World War II and you look at the soldiers and the army units that were attacking Russia in 1941, that the Reichswehr, the regular Prussian army units, were there, yes, fighting at the front, but alongside those army units, alongside the regular soldiers, there were Waffen-SS units. So there were elite groups of SS soldiers, the Waffen-SS, that Himmler had grown and developed as a sort of fanatical military wing of the SS. So when Germany invaded Russia, and of course there were atrocities, huge atrocities committed. We'll do more on those in a later lesson, the mass murder of the Jews. The assumption of the old historians was that actually it was the SS who committed those atrocities, the murder of the Jews. It was the SS units that were doing that, and the regular Prussian units, the Prussian army units, were kept separate. That they fought the military battles, they moved on to the next target, and behind the lines it was the SS soldiers who were committing the atrocities. But a lot of recent research has shown that the regular Prussian soldiers, the regular army units that were not actually part of the SS, were very complicit. They knew that these atrocities were happening, and they didn't actually do anything to stop it. So that good examples of how the historians have realised that it was not as simple as we previously thought. So the suggestion very much, therefore, is that the infiltration of Nazi values and the gradual takeover by the Nazi movement of the army was much more extensive than we previously thought. Even another one, historian Bartov, has, the assumption was very much that the German army was largely a middle class army, and it certainly had been in the Kaiserreich in the days of Bismarck, and also to a large extent in the Weimar era, the sort of army as a sort of like an elite organisation. But obviously Hitler introduced conscription, so the masses, working class people, were brought into the army. But a lot of evidence now shows that those working class people who joined the army, many of them were actual brutal fanatic soldiers. So again, the assumption we did about the working classes, that the working classes never really agreed with the Nazis, because the Nazis crushed the SPD and the communists and took away their trade unions. But time changed, and that many working classes were indoctrinated, and there's evidence of sort of fanatical working class soldiers who were participating in the atrocities of World War II as well. So all of those sorts of points. And another point by the historian Bonart there has shown that after the Night of the Long Knives, large numbers of retired army officers joined the SS. So it wasn't just the SS joining the army, it was also the army joining the SS. It worked both ways. So complex picture. Okay, so one final aspect to consider, the churches. Okay, and again, like all the others, the point is more complex than we previously thought. Avoid sort of simplistic. Okay, so what are the key points? Now, Christian churches, you've got to distinguish. You've got to distinguish between the two types. There were the Catholic churches and the Protestant churches. Okay, and there are certain common factors that apply to both the Catholics and the churches and their attitude to the Nazis. But there are also factors that were specific to each and made them different. Okay, so you need to be able to articulate about the common factors. Okay, in terms of a common factor, both the Catholic and Protestant churches cautiously welcomed the rise to power of Hitler in 1933. Okay, but overall, the most active support came from the Protestants rather than the Catholics. Okay, but like all these things, there were significant exceptions to what I've just said. So you've got to be able to articulate that complexity of it. Overall, the Catholic Church more quickly regretted its decision to back Hitler. But having said that, the Catholic Church struggled to speak out against Hitler or to do anything to weaken the Nazi regime. Those are sort of like the key points in a nutshell. Now, developing those a bit further. Okay, so there's the point about the common factors. Whether you're a Catholic priest or a Protestant pastor, P-A-S-T-O-R, the equivalent of a priest, during the Weimar years, as a general rule, we've spoken about the sort of like Weimar image, a great deal of liberation, freedom, cultural, new, very modern in its outlook, and there was a conservative backlash, conservative reaction. Many, particularly middle class groups, and we mentioned, for example, there were groups of women who objected to this sort of onrush of freedom, who didn't see it as freedom, they saw it as a decline in standards. Well, that certainly applied for the church. That a unifying factor was they saw the Weimar era as a period of a decline in values, and in contrast to the values of Christianity, the Weimar years were sort of seen as materialistic, godless years. So, therefore, cautiously, when Hitler and the Nazi Party emerged in the 1920s and spoke out about restoring values and creating a strong Germany, and because remember, Hitler did not speak for what we know the Nazism was about. He was a chameleon. He gave audiences the messages they wanted to hear. We do know that the churches could see the advantages of Hitler being the Chancellor of Germany and cautiously welcomed him. Of course, one of the things was that Hitler promised to crush Marxism, and Marxism was atheistic. True Marxism sort of presented religion as, quote, the opium of the people, as a drug that was distracting people away from the true cause, which was to fight against the capitalists. And so when Hitler came to power and Hitler promised to crush communism, that was seen in a very positive light. Also remember, the church was very wealthy, in particular the Catholic Church, huge landowners, etc., etc. If the communists had taken power, that would have been taken away from the church. So all of those sorts of reasons to cautiously welcome the Nazis. Now, we mustn't overegg that. It was very cautious. There was obviously a great deal of discomfort with the unsavoury aspects of Nazism, the sort of like the radicalism of the stormtroopers and the use of political violence. Sat very uncomfortably with Christian values, and hence another reason why the Night of the Long Knives was so significant, because if you were a church person, the Night of the Long Knives again was presented as Hitler taking action to restore order. So all of a complex picture. Okay, so there's that sort of point. The early years, 1933 to 34, cautiously welcoming the Nazi regime, and you need to be able to articulate that. And we know that Day of Potsdam, on the 21st of March 1933, the ceremonial reopening of the Reichstag was held in a church. We know that Hitler's first speech, the appeal to the German people of the 31st of January 1933, he referenced God 5 times. We know that the Catholic Centre Party voted for the Enabling Act. So you can see the evidence of that cautious welcoming of the Nazi regime. Centre Party voted for the Enabling Act. That's the following the Day of Potsdam is another example of that. So it's almost, in particular with the Catholic Church, and focusing on that one now, if you're a Catholic, it's almost like they convinced themselves that Hitler was doing good, in spite of the fact that he is removing freedoms, creating a one-party state, crushing the rights of the people. It was seen at the time as a necessary thing to do to get rid of the godless Weimar era and to repress communism. And then, of course, very importantly, if you're talking about the Catholic Church, you must mention the Concordat, Hitler's first agreement with a foreign power, so to speak, was with the Vatican, the famous Concordat with the papacy, in which Hitler gave a blatant lie, basically. He guaranteed that if you were a Catholic in Germany, he would not remove their rights to worship, that they would continue to have the rights to go to church and to lead their religious lives. And in return, the papacy promised that priests would not pass political comment on the Nazi regime. So the Concordat, in a sense, was the equivalent of the oath of loyalty with the army. It kind of bound the Catholic, but for the Catholic Church, it sort of bound them in an agreement to support the Nazi regime. And a bit like the army, the Catholic Church took that oath very, very seriously. They took that agreement very, very seriously. Whereas a bit like the story with the army, for Hitler, any agreement wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And as with the army, Hitler just basically trod over their rights, the same with the Catholic Church. Okay. So that sort of concept of the Catholic Church being trapped by the Concordat is so develops that a bit further. This continues to be about the Catholic Church. Hitler had no intention of keeping his promises. From 1935 onwards, the Nazi state increasingly broke the agreement. Okay, so examples of that: Catholic youth groups closed down, crucifixes were removed from church schools, and of course, the papacy fully understood, and the Pope in 1937 could see what was happening, and he did then issue an encyclical, a published document, expressing deep concern. It was called Mit brennender Sorge, with deep anxiety, that the regime was breaking the terms of the Concordat. But it had little impact on the behaviour of German Catholics, because German Catholics, most of whom, Catholics, remember, were from all walks of society. They were working class, they were middle class, Catholic women, all of those reasons that we've already said. Most German Catholics had a reason to think, well, okay, yes, the Pope has spoken with deep concern, but we can see the benefits that the Nazi state has given to us. So their support was never active, but it was continued to passive. But there were misgivings, no doubt about it. A bit like the army, so you can make those sorts of comparisons there. So that's the Catholic side. Never really were able to, the doubts appeared, but never really presented a problem to the Nazi regime. And that sort of was something that the Catholic Church then had to wrestle with after World War II, with the collapse of Nazism and Hitler's death, and the evidence of the atrocities of the Holocaust began to emerge, and that sort of guilt, could we have done more? Could we have stopped that happening? is something that is still an important issue within the Catholic Church. Now, the Protestant Church was a slightly different story. As I say, they cautiously welcomed the regime. Be very clear, if you're a Protestant pastor, you're Christian, you believe in Christian values, and like the Catholic Church, they would have had question marks about the Nazi regime, and in particular the violence of of their rise to power and how they had used violence. But remember, the legal revolution, Hitler's rise to power, was always presented at every turn as being legal, and I think that's probably one of the key things that trapped the Protestant Church more than anything else. So yes, those factors there. The Protestants had distrusted the Weimar Republic for the reasons we've just said, but also because the Catholic influence, the Centre Party, and so there's an added complexity that when Hitler came to power, and of course the eradication of the political parties partly meant the eradication of the Catholic Centre Party, which was welcomed by some members of the Protestant Church. But the other, I think, probably the most important thing, remember, like our own Church of England, the Protestant Church was a national church. So patriotism, pride of their country, was very much rooted in its attitudes. It was a nationalistic church. And remember, Nazism was a nationalistic political party. It professed German values as being the most important thing. Now, we, of course, now see that Nazi nationalism was very racist in its tone. Okay, it was not traditional nationalism, but that was not necessarily seen so overtly at the time. People were aware of it, but at the same time they were seduced by the constant waving of the German flag and so on and so forth. So the Protestant Church in the Weimar era was right-wing in its inclination. So traditionally in the 1920s, the Protestants, German Protestants, traditionally supported the right-wing parties like the German People's Party and the DNVP. And so they were when Hitler took power in 1933, there was again that sort of cautious support. They saw him as, a slightly more radical or rough around the edges form, not as respectable as the traditional right-wing parties, but hey, he can work for our interests. So very much part of the sort of conservative establishment view of the Nazi regime. So as a result, many Protestants found the switch from the Weimar Republic to the Nazi regime relatively easy if you were a Protestant, because they would say, well, Hitler is restoring law and order, he's restoring strong government. So what then happened in the Gleichschaltung is part of it. We traditionally talk about the getting rid of the political parties and crushing the trade unions and establishing a strong centralised structure, getting rid of the federal states, etc. But part of the process of Gleichschaltung involved coordinating the Protestant church. And so what Hitler did is he took over the top level of the Protestant church. He imposed a sort of like Nazi leadership on the top level of the Protestant church. So he put into position a Reich bishop called Ludwig Müller, and the top level of the Protestant church was restructured. It was renamed the Reich Church. Hitler created a Ministry of Church Affairs and put a Nazi, Hans Kerl, in charge of church matters. And the Nazi regime was also, to a large extent, it also Gleichschaltunged the Protestant church at the lower level. So new young priests were sort of like put into position from a radical wing of the Nazi party that were called the German Christians, also nicknamed the Stormtroopers of Jesus Christ. They were priests, they were pastors, but they were very radical in their sort of views, with strong aspects of anti-Semitism within this sort of extremist wing of the Nazi party called the SA of Jesus Christ. So if you imagine the Protestant church as a sort of pyramid structure, what basically happened in 1933 is that the Nazi regime very stealthily took over different elements of that pyramid structure, which brought basically an organisation that was largely compliant and passively supported the Nazis, but it brought them under the control of the Nazi Party more fully. So why was Hitler able to do that with the Protestant Church and not the Catholic Church? Well, because the Protestant Church was a national church. Its leadership was not abroad, okay? Whereas the Catholic Church, the leader was the Pope. So that was always going to be a problem. Hitler could not do that with the Catholic Church, but he could do that with the Protestant Church because the Protestant Church existed solely within Germany. So that's certainly aspect of control is an important factor. And then the other thing which is really important to emphasise is that, yes, although largely the Protestant Church initially compliant because it respected the authority of the regime and then increasingly taken over, the Protestant Church never really did form a problem for the Nazi regime throughout the 12 years. But nevertheless, there were within it, you mustn't talk about all Protestants clergy as if they were all passive supporters of the regime. There were many brave Protestant clergy who did speak out, and they lost their jobs and they were thrown into concentration camps, and they did try to resist. But it had little effect. The most famous is Pastor Martin Niemöller, who formed the Confessional Church. About 2,000 Protestant pastors spoke out and formed a rival church to the Reich Church. They broke away, they formed a splinter church, and they rallied together behind an emergency league to object the fact they disagreed with what Hitler was doing and his policies, and the fact that fundamentally the Nazis were unchristian in their approach. But ultimately, did that have impact? At the time, little. It was repressed, it was crushed, they were thrown into concentration camps. In the bigger picture, it did have impact because we know about it. I think that's an important point as historians, and that's, in a sense, what they would have regarded as a success. Many of them did not live to see the end of the war, but they would have said, we have achieved something because we have shown that there were strong, decent Protestant pastors who were prepared to speak out, even though they knew they would end up incarcerated in concentration camps, and many of them therefore lost their lives. The legacy was that there were brave priests, many of them, pastors, many of them, within the regime. So that's an important point again to emphasise. Okay, so there's the final picture in a nutshell. Complex, different groups, complex picture. So you could remember get an essay just on popular opinion as part of the depth study question in section B, or if you get a depth study section B, if you get a breadth study, you have to cover the whole 120 years in 45 minutes. Much of this you could bring into those breadth study questions when the part of the essay where you focus on the Nazi regime. Okay. There's a few concluding slides. I'll leave you to read through those points yourself, with the names of key historians who kind of like revolutionised the way in which we think about the sort of like recent research and the key historians. Just worthwhile picking up one or two of these points very briefly. So there's that word historiography. Historiography has very much changed. Older historians, if you're going to sort of like try to capture it, the older historians of the 1950s tended to place much more emphasis on the terror aspects, the fact that the regime controlled a population who did not like the Nazis. But recent research has demonstrated that it's much more complex. There was a lot more popular support for the Nazis than we previously thought. There's that word consent, that support for Nazism was in part about control from the top, but it was also about popular consent from below. But also much of the recent research linking to what we've done before has demonstrated the Nazi regime was relatively chaotic. This historian here, Galately, wrote a book called The Gestapo and German Society. And what's interesting with him is that previously, before that book was written, the assumption was that the Gestapo, the German secret police, the Nazi secret police, a sort of subsection of the SS, was very, very all-pervasive, a bit like Stalinist Russia. There were Gestapo police chiefs everywhere, and they were very, very efficient. And Galately has shown that actually the Gestapo were a relatively small organisation, and he kind of like debunked the argument that the Nazi police state was all-powerful, and he did a lot of work to demonstrate that actually the SS was not as powerful as previously thought, because there weren't simply not enough of them, and they were trying to do too much, and certainly after so we sort of view that within this sort of argument that the regime was not as well ordered as we previously thought. It was much more chaotic, which kind of opened up new ways of thinking about things. So it weakened the old argument that terror and control were the important aspects, and it kind of opened the way to historians to look at the ordinary people and to say, wow, look at ordinary people, they willingly consented and supported the regime. Goldhagen was an example of the latter, wrote a key book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. The title of the book says everything, Ordinary Germans, and how ordinary Germans, there's evidence to say they were compliant in working towards the Holocaust. Very, very groundbreaking book. And like all these books, it provoked reaction and opposition to what he said, and the debate is still happening. So as a result, more historians have emphasised complicity, compliance, consent. There's that historian Galately that I just mentioned, and Goldhagen I've just mentioned. And Richard Evans wrote a book in 2015 called The Third Reich in History and Memory, and he wrote a key essay in there called The People's Community. I'll upload that to the Padlet area. And he tends to sort of like the pendulum swings back the other way. And he said people like Goldhagen have over-egged the idea of popular support, and Evans sort of like says that we've got to revisit and look at that issue of control. Control was actually, as the original historians of the 1950s argued, control was important. And Evans argues quite a strong case about the importance of terror as well. So all of those are important factors. Just to remind of the follow-up, make sure you pick up that chapter about from Noakes and Pridham. And our next learning will be about Nazi racial policy. In the years 1933 to 35. Now, the slide tells you what your flipped learning is, but just a reminder, that lesson will be a YouTube lesson. So watch your emails, watch this YouTube area. There will be a new lesson coming up about Nazi racial policy, 1933 to 35, which is a part of the depth study. Thank you very much. I'll stop at that point and leave it to you to work on your notes on this. Thank you.